a new feature on Zoom we have to negotiate. My name is Mo Lovett and I'm a Programme Manager here at the Academy of Ideas, and I'll be chairing this evening's discussion, which has been organised by my colleague Jacob Reynolds, who will also be the co-chair, and our partners for the debate, SATSA, the voice of inbound tourism for South Africa. Now, global Britain is a concept that has been much talked about, at least here in the UK, particularly in relation to the UK's decision to leave the European Union. The Conservative government has put forward an aspiring and a positive case for the UK's role in the world. And yet, despite being one of the leading countries in terms of its vaccination rollout programme, severe travel restrictions remain in place for many Britons wishing to travel abroad, either for business purposes or for pleasure. Despite the announcement today that the government will end quarantine rules for the fully vaccinated on amber list countries on July 19th, many countries still remain on the red list, including South Africa. As I'm sure you're aware, returning from red listed countries requires you to pay for the privilege of quarantining in a hotel room. Less often mentioned, however, is the fact that even this option is not available to non-UK residents. In other words, should you live in a red list country like South Africa, you are essentially banned from coming to the UK. Now, for this debate, we have focused a fair bit on South Africa, but this isn't just because of our involvement with SATSA. Through the Commonwealth, mutual migration and the cultural and historical links between the UK and South Africa, the two countries have long enjoyed close ties. Moreover, the media focus on the so-called South African variant has made it a flashpoint in the discussion. But it also helps us to more broadly understand the impact of these travel bans in terms of tourism, conservation, investment, and international sporting and cultural life, but also the impact these travel bans are having on developing economies of the wider African continent. Now, I am delighted to introduce our four speakers for this evening in the order in which they will speak. With a note of apology that Dr. Remy Adekoya, who is due to speak this evening, is unfortunately unable to join us. So we have Michael Spicer. Michael is the chair of Westgrow, the Cape Town Tourism Investment and Promotion Agency. Then we will hear from Virginia Messina, who is the Senior Vice President Advocacy and Comms of the World Travel and Tourism Council. Alistair Donald, who is an Associate Director of the Academy of Ideas, co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival, convener of Living Freedom and co-director of the Future Cities Project. And last but not least, we have Cheryl Jacobs, who's a columnist at the Daily Telegraph newspaper here in the UK. Now, each of the speakers will have up to 5 minutes to present us with some opening remarks, provocation, if you like, for a wider debate. And I know many of you in the audience have a particular link to South Africa, and after hearing from our panelists, we'll come out for questions and contributions from you from the floor. The aim of all Academy of Ideas events is to generate a genuinely public collegiate discussion. So feel free to attend to the specifics of the UK-South Africa relationship, but also to reflect more broadly on the wider ramifications of these bans, because there is so much to address. So do turn on your camera if you can. Please stay muted for while we have the opening remarks, but it'd be nice if we could see you, feel like we're all in the same room together and we're having part of a discussion. Not quite the same on Zoom, but I think we can try really hard to give it that kind of collegiate feel, and do feel free to get involved in the discussions. So Michael, I wonder if we could start with you, please, if you could unmute yourself and give us your initial thoughts.
Thank you very much indeed, Mo, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thought I'd begin with a little summary that I sent to Mo, because that captures essentially the arguments that I want to make. I will open with a listing of the new evidence and science on which the red listing of South African travel is really called into question. I'll set out the cost of travel bans to the tourism value chains, and particularly to employment, development, and conservation, clearly negative for South Africa and Southern Africa and Africa as a whole, indeed, but also contrary to the UK's economic, cultural, and reputational interests, the global Britain vision and mission. With the opening domestically, which has been proposed on the 19th of July in the UK, it would be incompatible with the vision and goals of global Britain to maintain the current posture in relation to many of the countries which have travel bans, and in our case, South Africa. That would be more of a fortress Britain posture. And it would reinforce perceptions of exacerbating inequality and also fanning some of the resentment, not to say anger, at inequalities and also the lack of access to vaccines, which is around at the moment. So I'm proposing that one of the first actions following on the opening up in the UK would be to move South Africa from red at least to amber. So in terms of the new evidence, it must be admitted immediately at the outset that South Africa is currently undergoing a third wave, and quite a serious one. But firstly, the case numbers in this third wave are still below those new case numbers in the UK. Secondly, the Delta variant, which is dominant in the UK, is now also dominant in South Africa. Up to 75% of new cases are of the Delta variant. The Beta variant, which was the so-called South African variant, which caused all the alarm and which led to the red listing of South Africa, is no longer seen as causing vaccine problems. New studies have come onto the market, in particularly a large-scale study in Canada, which has shown that AstraZeneca vaccine is 83% effective on the Beta variant. All the other vaccines are effective for Delta and indeed for all the current variants. Fourthly, there are signs already that the third wave may be peaking, particularly in the economically important heartland of Gauteng. Fifthly, and relatedly, it is estimated by the South African National Department of Health that up to 60% of adults have now been exposed to COVID. They have COVID antibodies. And these statistics are reliable because South Africa has first world genomic and medico-scientific personnel. Indeed, the first sequencing of a variant was done in South Africa, and that was the science on which the UK based its sequencing of its own variant thereafter. Finally, the vaccination program in South Africa, which has hitherto been slow, is now accelerating quite satisfactorily, and vaccines are no longer constrained in terms of supply. So in terms of tourism, in 2019, almost 500,000 Brits came to South Africa, of whom 100,000 were visiting family and friends. The overall spend was something short of £1 billion. Now that is all pretty much evaporated with the travel bans and the various lockdowns. This is an exceptionally important industry for South Africa. It employs 1.5 million people. It's been estimated that up to 10 people are supported by one job. 70% of employment is female in this industry. And most of it is young, relatively unskilled people who find it difficult to find jobs in other sectors. And of course, you know that South Africa has quite a significant unemployment problem. Yet, having said all of this, if you look at fully vaccinated British would-be tourists, they would be facing no greater risk in South Africa than at home, given the statistics that I've given you, and given the fact that many of the tourism sites in South Africa are in relatively unpopulated areas. Conservation, a very important thing, is threatened by the travel ban because many of the income streams that support it do come from tourism. And Britain, one of the goals of Global Britain is, of course, biodiversity. Equally, Global Britain has set up a new institution for trade and investment with South Africa, and the continued ban would harm that development and, of course, open the way for other investors to take the place of Britain as one of the dominant investors in South Africa. The vision, of course, of Global Britain is also committed to focusing on the bottom billion, reducing poverty, and unemployment, and particularly focusing on women. All of these would be gainsaid if the bans were to continue.
About 30 seconds, Michael.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up now. So the summary then is that nations such as the United States have already taken the move to move South Africa from the red to an amber watch list. And I think if you look at the evidence, it is quite safe for Britain to take that, particularly as it is opening up itself and is willing to live with the risks of doing that and not willing to try and set out on a zero COVID mission. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. I think that set us up very nicely for the discussion to come. Virginia, I'll come over to you next, please.
I mean, just a sort of a quick, brief introduction to who we are. So the World Travel and Tourism Council effectively represents the private sector globally. So we represent all the different industries and across the different geographies. So our members are sort of the top 200 CEOs of one of the biggest brands that you're probably familiar with. And we also have some destinations as part of our membership. So we were set up to analyze the impact that travel and tourism has in the economy. So we have a methodology to measure the impact on GDP and jobs. So we're very familiar, again, to some of the things that Michael said. And just to put things into perspective, over 9 consecutive years, travel and tourism grew faster than the global economy. And that means that and that trend was obviously set to continue. Now, in 2019, travel and tourism represented 10.4, if we go back to the previous slide, 10.4 of global GDP. And more than 330 million jobs were in our sector. So that means 1 in every 10 jobs in the planet were in travel and tourism, but also 1 in every 4 new jobs were in our sector. Now, as we know, the impact of COVID has been devastating, and it's interesting to compare it to the global economy. So our sector dropped by more than 49%, whereas the global economy had a 3.7% drop. Now, in terms of employment, we know more than 62 million jobs were lost, but actually many more remain at risk, obviously supported by the furloughs and other employment support schemes. So the next slide is just to show again the impact of COVID-19, and the previous crisis we could compare this to was the global financial crisis in 2009, where there was a significant impact, but only of 4% drop when it comes to our contribution to GDP. Now, again, as I said, COVID has hit us hard, and minus 49.1%, which is effectively 18 times more than the global financial crisis. So I have a few figures for the UK and South Africa. I won't go into a lot of detail, just to say, in terms of the UK, it's by far been one of the hardest hit countries, a result of a combination of lockdowns, travel restrictions, stringent measures that we probably are all very familiar with, resulted in a drop of more than 62% when it comes to travel and tourism GDP, so obviously much above the drop of the global economy. 72% drop when it comes to employment in travel and tourism, and both international and domestic spend were severely impacted. This is obviously, as I said, result of lockdowns and other measures. Now, the UK dropped by 4 positions in terms of the top 20 biggest economies in the world, so from the 4th biggest economy to the 8th. The next slide is just showing some figures on South Africa, and Africa as a region, was obviously affected as many others. Still, 49.8% drop, so still above the impact of the global economy. significant impacts in terms of employment. So again, related to Michael's comments, we had more than a 32.4% drop when it comes to jobs in travel and tourism. So again, for a country that is significantly reliant in this industry, it's obviously a big impact. Despite this, I have to say South Africa remains the second largest economy across the continent, followed by just following Egypt, which is the biggest economy. Again, 66% drop in terms of international visitor impact, and not such a bad drop when it comes to domestic. So the next slide is just some of the things that we've been advocating for, or that we believe need to be in place to have a recovery and a sort of safe reopen of international travel. And things we've been talking to governments about is having a clear roadmap on when these measures are going to be relaxed, because that allows not only not only to rebuild consumer confidence that is obviously much needed, but also industry to prepare. So having measures of reopening from one day to the other, or changing countries from list from one day to the other, is not helpful. I think we need that time to ramp up operations and for both consumers and industry to be ready. Having a
30 seconds, Virginia.
Data-driven framework to reopen, and we'll talk more about what this means in addition to the vaccination. And then lastly, coordination and harmonization are essential. So I'll just move to the next slide. I know we'll be talking about all these things, which was the last slide, but these are some of the trends that we are seeing as a result of COVID. So the rise on digital technologies, the impact on sustainability, which I know is something we'll discuss, health and hygiene, and the need to coexist with COVID. So I'd leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sorry to rush you at the end there. Great to have the slides as well. Alistair, if you could unmute yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mo. And thanks, Michael and Virginia, for someone who's not so familiar with the South African context. And I think that was very useful to see in detail some of the things that are affecting you. And obviously, it's good and necessary to understand the impact of the pandemic in terms of potential medical and public health benefits and impacts and economic impacts and all the rest of it. There's obviously important and legitimate arguments to be had about the extent to which creating barriers to the spread of a dangerous virus necessitates restrictions and the curtailing of individual freedoms. To my mind, you can recognize the need to impose some restrictive measures, while at the same time, in a more general sense, being deeply concerned about the way that civil liberties are being sidelined. You can accept some of the time-limited measures that we've seen over the past while still being staunchly opposed to the seeming at times tearing up of so many of the hard-won freedoms associated with our liberal democracies, whether that be freedom of assembly or free speech, and I suppose most pertinently for this discussion, freedom of movement. And in particular, I'm worried about the way that the pandemic is being seen and interpreted as some sort of wake-up call, as a kind of warning sign that such are the high levels of risk faced by modern societies, and so vulnerable are we as individuals to new diseases, that it necessitates not just short-term restrictions, but in some people's minds that we get used to a new normal and accept ongoing restrictions in social and cultural life. And indeed, perhaps the most disturbing thing I think about this pandemic so far is not the virus itself, as devastating as that has been, but how quickly many societies have learned to live with lockdowns, and even, sad to say, embrace them alongside the idea that we should almost be looking at reorganizing social life around them in the longer term. In the UK just now, for example, the announcement that the lockdowns, as Michael has said, are going to be lifted on the 19th of July has been met in some places with a bit of an outcry that we should even consider lifting the restrictions at a time when the Delta variant still exists. And that's despite the fact that all the evidence seems to suggest that the vaccines have largely broken the link between infections and hospitalizations and deaths. Many are also outraged that we're dispensing with masks, which is seen as, in some quarters, reckless and irresponsible. Look how it's reduced the levels of flu, some people say, as if flu is a kind of major new public health threat rather than a disease that society learned to live with many years ago. So the sense that society exists in some sort of state of vulnerability and that people are at risk isn't, I think, simply the product of COVID, but actually of longer term cultural trends that have been evident for some time and which COVID has come along and interacted with and had the effect of reinforcing and I think probably accelerating as well. This has been, I think particularly evident in recent years in relationship to travel, where you've had ideas like over tourism has been common, ideas in travel industry more broadly that we need to instigate degrowth have gained popularity, pushing the view that tourism economy has grown too fast and that a kind of ethical reining in of the desire to travel is better than risking mass tourism. Especially, it's a discussion that especially takes place in relation to cities like Venice and Barcelona, which are seen as particularly vulnerable to these impacts, but as a broader discussion as well that I think has a worldwide impact. Now, given that ethical tourism and the idea of the staycation, staying at home rather than going abroad, and all these types of associated arguments seem to stress the benefit of discovering your own community. And the way that they've gained popularity in recent years over what previously might have been assumed as the benefits of exploring further afield. Perhaps it's not surprising that with COVID lockdowns, with instructions to stay at home, not leave the neighborhood, not cross regional boundaries into other areas, perhaps it's no surprise that some of these things have a kind of resonance just now and have met in some quarters with relatively little resistance. As the flip side to such arguments for relocalization and against travel, which is, I think, what we're dealing with, is that we accept limits to our freedoms to choose. Indeed, those that do choose to travel are kind of fingered as morally dubious, asserting their travel over what other people look at as their right not to be bothered by travelers. So I think this is a kind of problematic thing, that situation that we're getting into just now. And
30 seconds, Alistair.
One of the problems is that for some commentators and researchers, the onset of COVID, I think, has become really a means to further reinforce this desire for a more ethically based responsible tourism. As one recent survey in the Financial Times put it, people will be more aware of health and safety issues for at least a generation, meaning that customer demand for less crowded travel will be evident. And not only did they think that was a good thing, but actually in this piece, it was very much heading to a situation where tourism was promoting luxury travel rather than mass tourism. So obviously cutting the benefits and the possibilities for more widespread tourism, with, I think, probably evident downsides, because let's face it, travel and discovering new places is one of the great freedoms that we've won over the years, and I think it's something that we should look and defend rigorously.
Okay, thanks. Oh, perfect. I was just about to get bossy with you there. Thank you. That was great. Thanks, Alice. There's so much to think about. Cheryl, hi.
So I was just going to round off with some philosophical food for thought. I'm actually going to agree wholeheartedly with Alistair. Want to think a bit about what the decline of global tourism means for the spirit of the age and the spirit, indeed, of individuals. This phase in human history, potentially, this sort of shrinkage, incidentally, was predicted in science fiction. One of my favourite authors, E.M. Forster, wrote a book called The Machine Stops in 1909, and it describes a world in which almost all humans have lost the ability to live on the surface of the earth. So each individual lives in isolation in a cell in which all of their bodily and spiritual needs are met by this omnipotent global machine. Anyway, if you haven't read it, I really recommend that you read this book, because it is so prescient on lockdown. But anyway, there's a quote from the book from a character, Vashti, who I wanted to read out from. And she says, I quote, of course, she had studied the civilization that had immediately preceded her own, the civilization that had mistaken the functions of the system and had used it for bringing people to things instead of for bringing things to people. Those funny old days when men went for change of air instead of changing the air in their rooms. And the reason why I picked this quote was I wanted to stress my fear that this may not be simply a short-term emergency that many of us are campaigning to put a stop to, but indeed a potential change in the spirit of the age, from expansiveness to inwardness, from techno-optimism to super catastrophic pessimism, from growth, an emphasis on growth to an emphasis on simply survival. And underpinning this shift, I think, is the belief that that free-flowing globalist capitalism is unsustainable. And both the public health industry and the green industry believe this. From a public health perspective, of course, they would argue that COVID has destroyed any illusion that improvements in public health and pharmaceutical advancements are sufficient protection against viral flows, even for the West, crucially. And obviously with 80% of carbon emissions being as a result of international travel, it speaks to the idea that tourism is not sustainable. And I think that this revelation about globalist capitalism collides with the morality really which underpins Western secular world, which is, I would term it, modern humanitarianism, which is absolute emphasis on preservation of human life. And I think that Western morality is tilting increasingly towards this attitude that to preserve life, quantity of life will have to be somewhat sacrificed. And that applies not just to Britons who will have to holiday at home if they want to avoid uncertainty, and indeed preserve the health well-being of the world and nationally, but also Africans living in poverty, rather than reaching middle-class status. I think, therefore, the point I'm really trying to get at is the challenge is much bigger than merely hammering the government for its arbitrary traffic light system. I think you've got to challenge the morality of the new moralism. I think you've got to do that, you've got to try and raise awareness of how important tourism is to many developing countries, because that message is not coming across, I don't think, of the collateral damage that all of this has had. And indeed what tourism contributes to conservation efforts as well, because we're going to see this convergence of the sort of the public health campaign and also the green campaign against long haul or international tourism, long haul and short haul as well. And also I think the second really important thing to do will be to present a vision of a world in which the whole world does learn to live with COVID. I think that the big challenge for that is, how do we ensure that the world reaches herd immunity? Some people putting that aim for the end of next year, which may or may not be possible. Depends also on the pharmaceuticals companies and whether they will relinquish sort of patents for vaccines. The task is daunting, but we must try. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Cheryl. Okay, now let's go out to the audience like I promised. And what I'll try and do, if we've got lots of questions, you don't have to ask a question, you can make a point, contribute to the discussion with your own thoughts, either on South Africa, the UK, the relationship between the two. Cheryl talked about the wider African continent. Have we somehow in the West and Europe overlooked some of the commitments we had to development? Have we slightly ignored South Africa as a kind of gateway to the wider continent, a kind of route in, not only through travel and tourism, but also economically? Feel free to ask a question or raise a point on any of those issues or anything else. Okay, Briege, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please.
Hi, very interesting presentations, thank you. the thing that interests me particularly is how much around the world people have been really fear a return to normal, in a way that I think Alistair described how Alistair described very well how people react in Britain, and the difficulty people have in letting go of wearing masks here. And I wonder how, you know, particularly in South Africa, people think about the return of tourism. You know, is there a similar fear there about a return? Do people fear that because Britain has had so much negative publicity about the Delta virus, do people fear about importation of virus by the Brits, like they do, for example, or they did certainly in Portugal for a long time? And do poor people, who are arguably more likely to be affected by the virus, are they worried about the reopening of the economy? Although I can completely understand that they'd be desperate for it to reopen as well. So just interesting to know what people think of that.
Great, lots of things there, Brigitte. Thank you. I'll come back to the panelists shortly, but I'm going to take a few questions. So we're going to go to somebody called Galaxy A20E, which I'm sure is not your real name. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
My name's Lucy. I'm afraid I'm still working out the technology. I thought it was a really interesting point that you brought up about the green issues, with having the quantity of life per se without any consideration for the quality, but also the impact economically that it can have in other areas. So like travel with tourism, and it having an impact on the tourist industry and the people that are working in it. I've noticed that a few times with green energy, because that's happened with where some of the source materials can come from as well. That doesn't seem to get mentioned very often. There's a blanking off of economic impact sometimes. But the other thing I wanted to raise with travel, we're talking a lot about holidays and tourism, and I can appreciate that very much. However, travel doesn't just mean going on holiday, it can mean seeing family, seeing friends, and those are quite important things, to be able to connect with other people, especially family wise. And it's just that hasn't seemed to, and I'm not just on about here, I'm not on about here, it just doesn't seem to be brought up very often, the importance of seeing family and the need for travel with that. So after we've all been in isolation, I thought that might be worth bringing up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, no, I agree with you about that last point as well. So thanks for raising it. Noah Keats.
Thank you, Mo. No, really interesting contributions from the panelists. I just got a few points to make. Firstly, I wondered if the panel could comment on the very individualistic nature of the pandemic from a state-by-state basis. It really does seem to me that states have been left to fend for themselves, both on the initial health issue of getting PPE, of course, with travel and sort of no cost-benefit analysis of shutting off travel completely, and especially in the UK, a real desire to get countries on the red list, which, you know, I agree with. I think countries like India should have been put on the red list far earlier, but states being very much left to fend for themselves. Even with the COVAX scheme, trying to get vaccines across the world, there's clearly some examples of vaccine nationalism and a real disparity in terms of how states can be able to deal with the pandemic. Secondly, just another point, I wonder if the panel could comment on the need to almost celebrate the intrinsic benefits of travel rather than just looking at it from an instrumental basis and the economic benefits, and also like avoiding just looking at the exemptions that people had for travel and the fact that some people were able to travel because they were diplomats, or they might have been, you know, preparing a home for rent or whatever, which I think would have just furthered the animosity, the fact there were divisions in who could travel and who couldn't. And finally, also on domestic travel, I'm not as pessimistic as some of the panelists are about the benefits of domestic travel actually arriving in industries within countries that might not have had so much, benefits from travel over the last few years. So I wondered if the panel could just speak about, should people choose to holiday at home, whether that really is such a bad thing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Noah. Okay, Jacob next, please.
Yeah, I wondered if something maybe the panelists didn't note was the, I think, obvious parallels here between the way that increasingly international travel has been seen and then how the lockdowns were experienced in countries sort of nationally, which is that, as some people described, lockdowns as being a way that, say, relatively well-off people can continue living relatively normal lives and having nice gardens and all the rest of it, whilst working class people were still doing deliveries or working in supermarkets and all the rest of it. In other words, that the lockdown was experienced very differentially, and that lots of sort of working class people carried on trying to carry on with life, whilst middle class people were shielded from the effects of coronavirus. And similarly, it's not the same thing beginning to sort of happen internationally, where you have developed well-off countries slowly establishing or perhaps beginning to establish travel corridors in effect with each other, whilst keeping the rest of the developing world completely shut off from those benefits. And we would know them only because we continue to get shipping deliveries of stuff made in other countries. And I wonder if, so I don't think that is something that is for those of us who want to fight for a more open society in this respect, I think that's an important point to make. Secondly, I wonder if especially Virginia and Michael might reflect or rejoin to the fact that I'm personally beginning to get a little bit skeptical about how far data and figures and the epidemiology and all of that can really help in winning this argument. I think it's great that we can make those arguments, but is that the kind of right way to approach it, do we think, or do we need like a broader, kind of more full-throated defense of travel and freedom as such? And then my final point is something that I've been trying to understand the implications of myself for a while, which is that for many people who had sort of thought that, say, Britain departing the EU was not a moment of insulation and becoming more isolated and protectionist, yet one of the things we are experiencing is, as Cheryl sort of talked about very ably, is that increasing sense of protectionism and the sort of the sort of shortening of boundaries around countries and people adopting a more insular mindset. So is that a sort of consequence of some of the trends in global politics around increasing protectionism and the rest of it that we need to get to grips with, even if in, say, being supporters of Brexit as I was or something, that might have inadvertently contributed to that kind of a world?
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. I think somebody else had the hand up but have changed their mind, which is absolutely fine. Look, I'm going to come back to the panelists now. Speakers, you can feel free to pick up on any of those questions or points, run with them a little bit, add or contradict or argue against any of those. So we'll come back to you now, and don't feel you have to cover everything, but people in the audience, do keep raising your hands because we'll come back out for more questions in a moment. So Michael, do you want to come back on any of those points?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mo. To the first point made by Bridget, I really don't think there is a fear of return to normality. There is an overwhelming desire to return to normality and to, of course, to the employment and economic existence that would go with that. Just to remind once again, 1 in 7 South Africans put food on their table as a result of tourism. So this is not a sort of philosophical debate, it's a very practical issue. And there's no question in South Africa over tourism. You know, we're not welcoming 50, 70 million like France or Italy or something like that. We're talking about sort of 2.5, 3 million international travelers. So that's quite a different thing. The point that both Bridget and Jacob picked up about experiencing lockdown differently is absolutely opposite in the South African case, because, you know, in the less affluent areas, they are so dense that lockdown has tended to be fairly theoretical. Now, the downside of that is that there was a lot of infection quickly. The upside is that herd immunity has come around pretty fast. In Khayelitsha, just part of Cape Town, they reckon it's about 90% herd immune now. And the third wave is absolutely flat because that's happened. So I do want to just comment on this data versus philosophy. I think it's a both and. Much of the travel regulations, the traffic light system, is overtly predicated on evidence and science. And so I do think it has to be met with evidence and science arguments. But there is certainly a broader philosophical debate. And I think some of the features that have been identified by some of the questioners is absolutely right, about freedoms, about living with some risk, about being open to experience, rather than retreating into a sort of zero risk existence, which clearly means a much less quality existence for a mythical utopian search, because it'll never happen. Life, in any way you can conceive, is about risk. And there is no way even the most powerful government can, or indeed should, try and take away all risk. I think it's an essential quality of human existence. Certainly one will take sensible steps for risk mitigation, but that will always be the big debate, is where does that begin and where does that end? Family and friends, Lucy, your point, I think I did mention that, very important in the case of South Africa. 100,000 was the figure. And these are the base of human existence again. These links, the history, the culture of the two nations is intertwined, and there are just lots. I speak personally because I have children and grandchildren in the UK I haven't seen for 18 months. So this is an important feature, but I'll let my other colleagues in at this point.
Great, thank you. Virginia, would you like to come in on any of those points?
Yes, thank you. And actually, it's a nice segue, because one of the things I was going to mention is the social impact, or actually the increase on sort of mental health issues, domestic violence, and so many other social issues that have arose as a result of lockdowns, but also travel restrictions. This precise fact that people haven't been able to meet with their loved ones for so long. So it's that benefit that travel brings that I don't think was valued by governments. And we've had this conversation with governments, and what they've said is the investment that now will have to go into all these social programs to overcome these issues is going to be much higher than allowing travelers into the country. So I think it's that balance. And to Jacob's point about is looking at the epidemiological data the correct approach? It should be, as long as it's transparent. So for example, at the moment, we know, in some countries with similar infection rates, similar vaccination levels, particularly in Europe, there's still at different levels, or up until today, that you still had to quarantine. And the reason for that is because sometimes politics have also played a role. And I think that's something that we're certainly concerned about, because as long as it was, if it was only science driving this, then that would make sense. But unfortunately, it's not always the case. And again, we're not always conscious about those social benefits that were almost a given. Now, particularly in South Africa, we've touched on conservation and some of the other benefits that travel and tourism brings. And it's been really interesting to see that shift from over tourism to the impact of the lack of tourism. And this is a big issue, particularly in Africa. So we do work around against illegal wildlife trade. And we've seen how these wildlife communities are struggling because of the lack of tourism. So there were complaints, obviously, about the imbalance with having too many travelers in some of these sites. But now it's actually proven that the lack of tourism has resulted in so many more issues, of which the whole community is struggling, the wildlife itself is struggling, and of course the economy as a result. So I think all of these things hadn't been put into consideration, and are certainly, hopefully now, going to be more front mind of policymakers, hopefully. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Virginia. Alistair.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear Michael's firm defense of the fact that South Africa is very keen and willing to get back to something approaching an old normal, rather than what I was suggesting in the introduction was the desire elsewhere for a new normal. And that's heartening to hear, I think, and perhaps it is the case that different economic circumstances and a different cultural outlook can start to create that difference. I mean, obviously elsewhere in the Commonwealth, you have somewhere like Australia, which has taken completely the opposite approach, and which with very, very little infection anywhere within Australia, still has even now large swathes of its society shut down, which suggests that a very differential experience and a very different cultural outlook. And I think that's that sort of, when someone asked the question about the impact of the Greens and how that works its way through. But to me, it does seem that over the past 3, 4, 5 decades, as green ideas and environmental ideas have come to the fore and very much taken a grip on lots of countries within the West, and kind of the imagination, the cultural outlook of lots of countries in the West, that this is a really important fact. Because if South Africa is, it's not isolated, the whole idea of tourism is the interaction of people around the world with countries. And I don't think it's enough just for South Africa to want tourists if the tourists are coming from places where green ideas dominate and environmental ideas dominate, because the mindset of environmentalism and the problems that they see with tourism leads them inevitably to a situation where they're arguing that you should travel less. I mean, if the problem of traveling is that you create adverse impact and adverse situation in the way that Virginia just described there of some of the problems, if that is your mindset, then you will be reticent to travel, and that will create problems, because the idea is that stay at home is better than going out and exploring the world. So I think inevitably that's going to lead to a problem, which leads to Noah's point about should we actually be defending the intrinsic value of travel rather than trying to build the case around economic arguments. And I've got a lot of sympathy for that approach. I think travel should be seen as a good in and of itself. It's something that opens us up to the world, that makes us more worldly, that offers the possibilities of discovering new things, of meeting new people, of doing interesting things. And that in and of itself is enough for me, and worthy of celebrating, and worthy of justifying why we travel. And one of the problems I think that we're getting into just now is that it has become the case that because of the kind of ethical responsibilities that have been put on the traveller, then there are certain types of traveller who it's thought they're okay to travel. In this country, for the last few weeks, we had this regulation introduced where people who could justify traveling on the basis that they worked for companies that might create jobs or worked or achieve, they were diplomats or they were people in specific jobs within institutions. For example, we've welcomed in people for the Euros football championship on the basis that they deserve to travel because they're officials with UEFA or whatever. But other people are restrained from traveling, and that sort of two-tier system of those allowed to travel because ethically they're doing something that's okay, and the rest of us who are advised to stay at home and take a holiday in our own backyard. I think that's a real problem, and we should really make the case for mobility for everyone as a good thing.
Yes, I agree, Alistair, that one should celebrate, I think as Noah said, or was it Jacob, the importance of travel in and of itself. But I do think that there is plenty of scope for engaging, let's say, the less extreme green traveler in demonstrating the value of travel through conservation, through community engagement. And indeed, many of the visitors who come to South Africa, young people especially who are quite green-minded, find value in engaging with poorer communities, helping them develop, engaging in some of the conservation activities So again, it isn't an either or. At the extreme, of course, there are certain people for whom all travel is bad, and we were able to dismiss those. Interestingly, on Australia, they're a bit of a cautionary tale now for a society that has tried to zero risk entirely by closing off. They went the Fortress Australia route, and even so, the virus crept in. They closed down again and got complacent, didn't set up the systems for vaccination. Now the virus is spreading and the vaccination program is behind. So I think the route of extreme zero risk turns out not to be a particularly viable one. I thought that was just an interesting sidelight.
Thanks. Cheryl?
Yeah, just to pick up actually from that point, which sort of speaks to sort of this challenge from the green industry about long-haul travel. One thing that I think that a lot of tourists in Britain are not particularly aware of, green-minded tourists, is that actually outbound travel from less developed countries actually accounts for less than 2% of international travel. Essentially, half of global international travel occurs between 10 countries, and within these, a significant share comes from hypermobile elite, if you like, and actually, perhaps that is a reason to develop travel in the developed world, not to curtail it, but even encouraging people to use their air miles to travel long haul rather than doing like lots of short haul trips. I think could be an interesting part of that conversation. But anyway, to go back to, I think it was the first question about fear in countries. I think this is a really important point. It's a really tough decision that a lot of countries are going to have to make about whether or not to open up their tourism industries, because a lot of countries which rely on tourism have the most vulnerable healthcare systems. And while some countries like South Africa will be keen to open up, I believe others, sort of Mauritius, for example, less keen to do so. But it really underscores for me why it is so important that we push for vaccination across the world, and that it is not just sort of the prerogative of wealthier nations. It is abysmal, really, that we are not even going to reach the minimum aim, which was to have at least 10% of every citizen in every country vaccinated by September. And we are nowhere near reaching anything which resembles herd immunity. Herd immunity is around 70% by the end of next year. And the key to really changing that story is for the pharmaceutical companies to relinquish their patents so that we can have mass manufacturing of the vaccine across Asia and Africa. And until that happens, I don't see how we're going to make much progress. And my fear is that you're going to get effectively countries, I think about the red list countries now, specifically, who are cut off actually from the globalist system, effectively barred, and the consequences for that economically will be catastrophic. We don't normally hear much about the international economic cost of the whole world not being vaccinated. I believe that the IMF has put the figure at $6 trillion in 2022 or something. So there's vast figures swimming around, but I don't think that the message is really sinking in. And finally, I just wanted to pick up on that very pertinent point that was made about sort of the spirit of the age and it being more nationalistic, and whether Brexit has contributed to that. I would argue no. I would say that what is distinctive about what is going on is clearly we do live in this era of super catastrophic risk, if you like, with pandemics and other risks indeed. And I think that you are going to get a tendency towards more nationalistic behaviour, as we see with COVID, that is potentially counterproductive, because the world isn't safe until every single country is safe effectively. And I think that Brexit reflected a tension, but I wouldn't say that it contributed to it. It did reflect a tension between sort of the expansive definition of freedom and its more, perhaps more inward definition of autonomy. And I think that I often reflect on this, and whether more people were sold on Brexit as a form of autonomy rather than, you know, in terms of the global Britain stuff, which is I think it's a little bit of a niche libertarian thing. And I'm not sure whether that has sort of reflected in even sort of the Tories' sort of political message or the political agenda for Brexit as such. And that is playing out through the pandemic, because, you know, it is this fortress Britain versus global Britain. I think that Boris Johnson is very much ideologically behind the idea of global Britain, but the problem is, I think that turning Britain into a sort of fortress country more along the lines of Australia would be extremely popular. So there it is. But that's where leadership comes in.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, look, we'll go back out to Lucy briefly, because you've already had one question, and then we'll move on to Claire.
Just that we're talking about travel corridors to make everything safe, and that it's based on science. I'm not disputing that there isn't evidence for it, but it is very easy to bias the outcome by selectively picking studies. It would be very possible, for example, for me to go and meet a family member, not in their country, but in another country. For example, my dad's in Ireland. Rather than go and fly to Ireland or him fly to Britain, both of us could go and pick a third country and go and fly to the third country, which actually might cause more problems. That's not being considered anywhere, which is why I'm saying science, it's not inexact. This is where you learn from it and develop. The other thing as well, with the pharmaceutical companies not releasing the patents, I think it might be worth considering whether we value purely vaccinations or whether the outcome is antibodies, because people have naturally got antibodies. So like the gentleman was saying in Africa, with reaching herd immunity, would we classify that within our own system with these travel corridors as helpful in that situation, which I just think might be noting. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Claire, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please.
Thanks, everyone. You've all given me lots of things to think about, actually, but anyway, to confine to a few. I'm in the House of Lords now for my sins, and there isn't hardly a week goes by without somebody standing up and making a very big fuss about the cuts in the aid budget that the government has brought in. And I simply mention that because everybody stands up and makes very moving speeches about the abandonment of the developing world. And yet it actually seems that none of them draw the conclusions, because, you know, then they go on to entirely back up red lists or red travel bans and all the rest of it. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of understanding or cost benefit analysis of this. So whilst their concern is in relation to other parts of the world being given money, obviously one of the great things that holds back development is the inability to have proper economic relations, and presumably the travel bans having an impact on that. And I wondered if Michael could talk about, obviously South Africa is not a developing country, it's a fully developed country, but he's in a region where that might have an impact, and whether he has any comments on what's going to happen to the African region if this carries on. I also wanted to draw attention to when people talk about the Greens and what's the new normal and so on. I think we have to be honest and say that some people are rather opportunistically taking advantage of the lockdowns to push other agendas. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it sort of suits people to say, oh, look, nobody's flying or nobody's traveling or nobody's driving during lockdowns. Oh, that's what's been going on in the UK for the last week. So why don't we make that the new normal? And we've seen in the UK a real attack on car driving, and you can see that that can easily expand into international travel by a lot of environmentalists who say, well, we've kind of got used to this now. And so that's one of the things that kind of I'm quite nervous about, that although I understand what Michael's saying is people want the normal, the old normal back, he says in South Africa is much more ambivalent here. And I do think people are rather nervous. But my final thought was just that it did all feel a bit pessimistic a while ago. And I don't want to be over fatalistic about things, because things change. Because although I think people are, as Alistair's described, not almost like scared, not exactly scared to go out, but there is a hesitation there. You've only just seen with the Euros football tournament that, you know, the kind of that hesitation suddenly gets swept along with this joyous sporting event. And obviously one of the title of this event relates to another big sporting event, and that things can change, and that I think we have to encourage people and how can we use those kind of events to kind of change that kind of fatalism. And also I think that we've seen that there's been a change of ministers in the UK, and a whole different tone is set in. So I don't want us to be over fatalistic, but I also think things like this discussion, and I'm going to send this film of this debate to lots of people in Parliament, things like this discussion can change the narrative. So we do have to make an effort. I thought that Michael was almost implying if we change the rules, everything would go back to normal. I think it requires a more active intervention to change the narrative, not just the rules. And I'm hoping that in the middle of it all, that this discussion might contribute a little bit to that, but we need more of them, not less.
Great, thanks, Claire. Stefanos, please.
Hi, yeah. I've seen on Twitter today, there was a poll doing the rounds from The Economist, from Ipsos Mori, and it said 19% of people want curfew, 26% of people want permanently closing casinos and clubs, 35% permanently travel quarantine, and 40% permanently masks. So I just found that really shocking. I know it's only one poll, but it's there's a lot of people embracing that, especially with this discussion, obviously travel quarantines. I also wanted to make the point a little bit about elitism and travel in the future, and whether we're going to have more somewheres, less anywheres, like we've had recently. I mean, for example, the elitism shown for the no quarantine for UEFA officials, and also why aren't patents for vaccines going out? That does seem strange. I mean, you'd have thought trade would be one of the things they want to get back really quickly, but yeah, doesn't seem to be. Anyway, that's just the points I wanted to make.
Yeah, brilliant, really good observations. I'm going to go to my colleague Jeff next, who can't raise his hand but has been waiting a while, and then to you, Matthew. Okay, Jeff.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Sherelle for mentioning that E.M. Forster book, because that's just the sort of book I'm interested in reading, and maybe we discuss in our book club or whatever. It's a good suggestion. I mean, just on some of the recent contributions have hinted what I wanted to say, which is that the reason for me that this meeting is an important moment is because we've discussed the industry figures and the figures related to tourism. We've discussed some of the broader political or philosophical trends, which mean that maybe explain some of the extension and reluctance to get rid of lockdown. And tourism combines many of the things, many of the main issues which people, which embody those. So there's aviation, which obviously combines people traveling around the world, flying and all the environmental stuff. There's the idea of people traveling from one country to another, mixing with each other, bringing new ideas and new experience, getting new experiences in new countries. And also now it's presented that they're bringing sort of new diseases. And it also embodies entertainment, which is something that's very important for society. But certainly in the UK, we're sort of going through a bit of a Puritan phase, and things which are done for joy and entertainment, with the exception at the moment of football, are frowned upon. And so I do think that whatever happens with the actual virus, there's a battle ahead in terms of moving forward and understanding many of the points that have been raised tonight, both in relation to the industry and the broader points, is very important in terms of fighting that battle and winning that battle. If you look, as the last speaker said, in relation to the UK, the fact that a large majority of people are outraged by the lifting of restrictions later this month, even though the vast majority of people are now vaccinated, that there's a disjunction, that the whole thing isn't just about the virus. This, as Stefanos has just said, there's something else going on where, where there's a reluctance to get back to what used to be called normal life. So I think having discussions like this and raising some of these issues, looking at some of the barriers to returning to a normal life, and finding like-minded people across the globe to have those discussions, make our cases in different parliaments and other places, is very important, because there are millions of people everywhere who do want to get back to normal, who do want to travel, who do want to go to the football and mix with other people. And I think if through these discussions and through our actions, we can make that the mainstream view in the coming period, then we're well on the way to achieving our goal.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Matthew, please.
Thank you. I think that Jeff's point there is where I could probably table for myself on the question of normalcy, and I'll return to it. Because I think I want to push back against Michael's claim that in South Africa there's this desire to return back to normalcy. And perhaps I'm pushing back against that cool Alistair's warmed heart, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think whilst it might be true that in certain quarters, particularly in the people who are most impacted economically by lockdowns, there's obviously a natural desire to return to it, I think we need to distinguish between the desire of people in that position and the desire of people in power. And I think a useful way to do that, because of course, as other people have mentioned, we've anecdotally and personally experienced lockdown in very different ways. But just to have a look at people whose voices are significant, I've just, over the course of the last 10 minutes, had a quick look at some of the journalists and politicians and commentators that I follow on Twitter. So here's a couple. Here's one leading journalist. Today, my story allows me to work from home. Feels very strange, but also so grateful that I get to be safe at home and not exposed. Another, we are all swimming in an ocean of trauma where unceasing waves keep hitting us. Be gentle with your hurt and exhausted heart. No one expects you to be fine. Another, those people who expect healthcare workers to be heroes, whilst they jaw, South African term for party, whilst they jaw with their friends on the weekend. I can't. Here's a legal commentator who spent the last 20 years fighting for employees' rights and for women's right to autonomy, retweets an article which says employers have a right to insist that their employees get vaccinated against COVID. And finally, here's a major political commentator who's so disenchanted with the political establishment that they want NGOs to take over. So what we have here is a confluence of vulnerability, of a reversal of political rights and allegiances, and a complete abandonment of politics for the sake of an elite of experts. This is not normal. This is not simply we can return to any degree of what we had before. I don't think it's enough to simply point to economic concerns and the desire for people to feed their families, because those people aren't making these decisions. They're not on Twitter. They're not on TV. They're not the ones that are deciding whether we go into lockdown. on Sunday when our lockdown will be extended, because it would be shocking if it weren't, they're not the ones making these decisions. I'll tell you who they are. They're the people, when I go walk outside from my very comfortable home in a leafy Joburg suburb, they're the ones working on the side of the road on a hot day wearing masks. I'm the one who on my gentle walk under deemed exercise don't have to wear a mask. Because it's very different. The police are not going to arrest white middle-class me. They're going to arrest black, poor worker on the side of the road. We're not going back to normal anytime soon until there's a radical change in our cultural and political outlook. So of course data matters. Of course data matters. But data is the handmaiden of our culture and our philosophy and our politics. And that has been broken from my perspective. And I really struggle to see a way back. But perhaps, as I started, perhaps that's just how I've experienced lockdown.
Thanks, Matthew. I was thinking similarly. I used to live in the Eastern Cape, and there's very definitely two societies. There's the towns and cities, and then there's of course the rural areas and the townships as well, the locations as well. So I'm very curious to know how some of the things that Alistair was talking about, I guess, about risk, vulnerability, the desire to open up, and actually how economic development and inward investment impacts upon different parts of South African society. Because, you know, I would imagine that you can feed a family for a lot longer if you're living in certain parts of South Africa than you can for others. So I'm just really curious to hear from South Africans, perhaps in the audience or on the panels, about what the real difference is towards inward investment and international tourism coming into South Africa for the different parts of South African society. Anyway, that's enough from me. David Frost, if you'd like to unmute, and if you can put your camera on, brilliant.
So to my fellow Josie colleague who's just espoused, I'm down the road from you. So let me just make the point that we've had domestic tourism open in this country since August last year. We've seen and we didn't have any vaccine at that stage. Our vaccine program, and I will admit this, has been slow, and we could have done much better. But we've seen no super spreading through domestic leisure tourism. And bearing in mind, we had a vibrant outbound market that has been totally curtailed. So that's all happening within South Africa. And the point is, I mean, we can all espouse about people on the side of the road and you in your zone and the new normal. But, you know, the point is we've really got to move forward with this thing. And this notion of sort of zero risk is, to me, an absolute anathema. We're not asking vulnerable people and I mean, the debate that we're having here is about the UK. I'm not asking vulnerable elderly people in the UK. I'm not herding them onto aeroplanes and forcing them to go to South Africa. But if you've been double vaccinated and you're a young person who has a yen for adventure and risk, and you want to actually have a holiday, there is no more risk to you coming out and having a holiday in South Africa than there is in having a holiday or moving outside your house in the UK. So we've got to open up. We've got to be bold in this, and we've got to start pushing the boundaries about this orthodoxy that we can actually live in a zero risk society. I mean, to me, it's folly, unless you're New Zealand. And the question to Jacinda is, it's great that you've done that, but how and when will you ever open up to the rest of us? So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, thank you. Looks like Michael wants to come back in. Actually, what I was going to suggest is, can I give the audience sort of a minute just to put your hand up if you've got any final questions, and then, because we're coming up to sort of 7:20 or 6:20, depending on your 8:20, sorry, go the right way around the globe. So what I might do is just let our speakers kind of wrap up in a moment and give you a little bit longer, sort of 2 minutes, 3 minutes each, to incorporate some of the questions and all the rest of it that we've had from the audience. So if nobody else wants to ask a question, this is me stalling for time to give you one more chance to find that raise hand button. If not, why don't we come back to the panelists for their for their final summing up. And I think we'll just go in exactly the same order as we did, because obviously, Michael, you've just had your hand up. So yeah, give us 2 or 3 minutes summing up and address any points that you want to within that, Michael.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mo. Well, I think it's been a very interesting debate and a vast range of views has been expressed. I particularly like Claire's point about drawing some positive and upbeat conclusions. I do think this is a campaign. I don't think we'll return. I didn't mean to suggest we can just flick a switch and return to normal. I do think, however, that South Africa, which is not, by the way, a developed country, is very squarely a developing, sort of middle order developing country, is quite substantially different to some of the developed societies. And the point I made again is the vast majority of South Africans don't have the luxury of sort of philosophical debates. They have to get to grips with everyday life, which has an immediacy that does not extend to us in the leafy suburbs. And that's where it is very important to have tourism, because it puts food on the table. I accept only really, I think, Matthew's point to the extent that our authorities have also, like so many other governments around the world, fallen in love with the power that COVID has conferred on them to order our lives and to flick switches up and down of lockdowns in various levels. And it's got quite comfortable to live in a sort of state of emergency. And I think we have to disabuse them of that. I'm very much persuaded by the sort of civil liberties argument. But generally, I've been encouraged by this discussion. And Claire, I should just end up with one little anecdote. I gathered that one of your colleagues in the House of Lords was declaiming just a few days ago how extremely dangerous the beta variant from South Africa was, and how at all costs the borders had to be sealed against the intrusion of this dreaded lurgy. Well, as I indicated earlier, and this is why data is important, that is a variant that's not much present now. And in any case, all the evidence now is that the vaccines are efficacious. So he is misinformed, he's behind the scenes, and we need to put people like that up to date with the new information. Thanks, Mo.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to leave us with any more thoughts? Virginia, we'll come to you next, please.
I mean, I'll keep it brief just to say, I mean, we know with crisis comes opportunity, and that's certainly the sorts of things that we're looking at. What is it that will emerge from this crisis that will shape the sector in the future in a more positive way? So, I mean, we talked about technology, and we talked about, I mean, the importance of sustainability, and I think that sort of increased emphasis on having a positive impact on the environment, on the communities, on societies, not only from governments but also consumers. I think that's definitely going to shape our sector in the future, and some trends. So we will be shifting from having 30 to 50 main destinations in the world to maybe having 200 or 500 people, because people preferences when they travel will be different. So perhaps if we won't go back to mass travel, that will take longer to come back, but just meeting family or friends in certain destinations will have a positive impact both in people's lives and in the economy. So I totally agree, we need to start going back to it and to certain sense of normality, while obviously there's caution, and I totally agree that vaccine and vaccine equity is a hugely important issue that will certainly get us back on track. So thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Virginia. Alistair, please.
I really liked David Frost's spirited defense of getting back to normal. I thought that was really good. But the talking it through in terms of the evidence shows us that we can get back to normal. I think to go back to one of the questions that was raised in the first round of questions about, is data and epidemiology enough to argue our way through to getting back to normal? I just think it isn't enough, actually, because the problem is that when you talk about data and when you talk about the science and epidemiology, then it always comes wrapped in a cultural context, which people interpret that data and interpret what's going on through that kind of cultural context. And because the cultural context just now is one that's focused on the risks and focused on our vulnerability and is inevitably pushes towards how we can secure our safety, then I think that, you know, it militates against being the data, the epidemiology purely on its own being enough to get us back. So I think we do need to take up some of these cultural arguments and these social trends and try and really understand them a bit more and make the arguments better for why it is that we can get out and about and discover things ourselves. I mean, again, to go back to one of the first questions about how do we return to normal, I mean, it seems to me that in the short, there is a short term and a longer term answer to this question. In the short term, I do think things like going to events. I mean, we have just had the football tournament here in London, and I was at a match on Tuesday night, and it was an incredible experience with 60,000 people, something I'd almost, 15 months on since I've been in a football crowd, almost forgotten what it was like. And everybody, once they were out there and in that crowd, was relatively relaxed. So there's something about just getting on with it that I think helps us and will start to make the case. I mean, going to the pub last night to watch the other match, coming out of the pub, it was a fairly joyous occasion because loads of people were collected together, and to some extent pubs have relaxed over the last couple of weeks with these sorts of events going on. In the longer term, I mean, I think there's one of the problems is that we are so risk averse and we are so safety conscious. So I think starting to culturally address those issues through political arguments and discussions like this, as Jeff was mentioning, is a good starting point for moving on. And just finally, just to come back to a couple of things from earlier. I mean, Michael said about the kind of it's good to go on conservation holidays, and I think Noah asked at the start about what's wrong with a staycation. So just to try and clarify, I mean, on an individual level, nothing's wrong with those things. I mean, everybody chooses to do what they want, that's fine. But again, I think once you start to factor in the wider sort of cultural issues around these things, then they do have an important, start to exercise an important constraint on what we do. And the Financial Times review of future arrangements for the travel in Europe was really quite revealing. I mean, it is now starting to talk about tourists being much more interested in securing privacy when they're on their holidays, maybe taking a step back from the big hurly-burly cities and crowds, and almost becoming retreating to private spaces in luxury hotels, and these tourist operators were very, very enthusiastic about that model as the way forward for the future. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that any of us will stop wanting to go on holiday, but it is indicative of the mindset, I think, in some quarters as to how things are to be in the future. So I think really starting to push back against that and to celebrate mobility and travel for what it is, I think is quite important now.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Alistair. And Cheryl, finally.
Yeah, so I think that the big challenge is to try and move the narrative from being simply one of how do we deal with COVID as individual nations to how do we, the entire world, deal with COVID. And I couldn't agree more with Claire. One of my big bugbears at the moment is this virtue signaling about the aid budget at the same time as being oblivious, apparently, to the impact of ongoing travel restrictions on countries which rely on tourism for up to 20% of their GDP. And also the impact on countries in Africa which are edging towards, or at least were edging towards, breaking through to middle income status. I'm thinking about countries like Rwanda and Kenya, who are very reliant on tourism, and also the business conference industry as well, which has been completely decimated. And I think that we just need to shout louder about these things. I think the other thing that needs to happen really is a campaign of awareness about the need to vaccinate more people around the world, and the fact that the pharmaceutical companies are not doing their bit to ensure that that happens, and there needs to be a lot more pressure put on them. Because I think also, I mean, especially in Britain, there's a sort of attitude that the pharmaceutical companies have been our saviors, and of course they have, but now we reach the crunch point where the attitude towards the patents is a real problem, actually, and so we need to challenge that. And I think the final big challenge is going to be to get across the message that travel is compatible with, you know, green concerns, people who are fearful about the future of the planet, especially travel to places like Africa, and conservation holidays, and the fact that actually Africa, just to take one region, does not actually contribute relative to the rest of the world that's significantly when it comes to carbon emissions through international flights. And it's especially important to make that case in the context of this new Puritanism, which was raised, this idea that anything that's hedonistic is selfish and dangerous. And actually, we just need to be better and more relentless at making the very basic point that things, you know, in a capitalist society, things which we do for our own pleasure can actually benefit other people. It's a very simple point, but I think that it's one which is being glossed and we need to continue to make. But thank you very much. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion.
It has indeed. Thanks very much, Cheryl. Okay, that's it. I'm going to leave the chat open. Sorry, I'm going to leave the whole event open for sort of 10-15 minutes. We'll stop recording now if anybody wants to hang around and have a bit more of an informal chat. Just to say, sorry to hear that your lockdown is going to be extended in South Africa. We are looking forward to the 19th of July and the reopening of society. And to celebrate that, we are having, the Academy of Ideas is having a one-day day of discussion, open for debate in Westminster in London, and I will put the details in the chat in a moment. Tickets are already on sale for that, so I hope if you are in the UK, you can come and join us for that. And oh, Jacob's already there, so please do come along for that, because if you've enjoyed this evening, I'm sure you will enjoy a full day of that kind of searching and open debate that we like to promote at the Academy of Ideas. So all that remains for me to do is to thank everybody, thank our partners, and to thank you panelists for provoking such an interesting discussion, and to everybody in the audience for their contributions as well, in the chat as well as in person. So thank you very much, everyone. Well done.
Thank you.